All right, today we're putting on our detective hats. We're going to crack a mystery that had scientists scratching their heads for centuries, and, in the process, uncover the basic rules of how life passes on its secrets.
I mean, have you ever thought about it? How can a tall plant and a short plant have offspring that are all tall, but then, out of nowhere, short plants just pop back up in the next generation? It seems impossible, right? Well, this is the exact puzzle that kicked off the science of genetics.
And to solve it, we're going to follow the trail of the guy who first cracked the case, Gregor Mendel. Back in the 1800s, this guy, with his garden full of pea plants, literally laid out the entire foundation for how we understand heredity today.
Okay, so what was his first major breakthrough? It was a huge clue he called the law of dominance. And it all started with his idea about these little inheritable factors. Let's get our terms straight. What Mendel called factors, we now call genes. And he figured out that for any given trait, you get two of them, one from each parent. The different versions of that gene, like the tall version or the dwarf version, are what we call alleles. So check out his experiment. It was so simple, but what he found was incredible. He crossed a purebred tall plant with a purebred dwarf plant. And in that first generation, the F1, every single plant was tall. The dwarf trait just vanished. But then he crossed those tall plants with each other, and suddenly the dwarf trait was back, showing up in a super consistent 3-to-1 ratio. So what on earth was going on? Well, this led him to his first big rule. Mendel realized that when you have two different alleles together, like one for tall and one for dwarf, one of them basically shouts over the other one. He called the one you see dominant, and the one that gets hidden recessive. And that's it. That's why all those F1 plants were tall. The dominant tall allele was just masking the dwarf one.
But you know how it is in science. You answer one question, and a brand new one pops up. If a dominant allele can hide a recessive one, how can you ever really know an organism's true genetic makeup just by looking at it?
And this, right here, is the hidden genotype problem. An organism's physical appearance, what we call its phenotype, doesn't always tell you the whole story about its genes or its genotype. As Mendel was quickly finding out, looks can definitely be deceiving. So here's the puzzle laid out. A tall plant could be what we call homozygous dominant, meaning it has two copies of the tall allele. Or it could be heterozygous, with one tall and one dwarf allele. Both plants look exactly the same. They're both tall. So how in the world could Mendel figure out which was which? To figure it out, he came up with a truly brilliant tool to basically force that hidden genetic information out into the open. He called it the test cross. The logic here is just so smart. To figure out the genes of your mystery plant, you cross it with a plant that you know is homozygous recessive, like a pea plant with white flowers. Why? Because that recessive plant only has one type of allele to give, the recessive one. It's a known quantity, a perfect baseline for a test. So the process is pretty straightforward. You take your violet flower, the one that's a mystery. It could be purebred WW, or it could be a hybrid WW. You cross it with a white flower, which you know for a fact has to be WW. And then you just sit back and look at the kids. The offspring will tell you everything you need to know. And there are only two ways this can possibly go, depending on what our mystery violet flower is hiding in its genes. Okay, scenario 1. Let's say our mystery plant is homozygous dominant, with two big W alleles. It's going to pass a dominant W to every single one of its offspring. The white-flowered parent, of course, can only give a little w. The result? 100% of the kids get the WW genotype, and every single one of them has violet flowers. But look what happens in scenario 2. If our violet parent is actually a heterozygote, big W, little w, it now has a 50-50 chance of passing on either the dominant W or that hidden recessive W. And this changes everything. Half the offspring are going to end up getting two little w alleles, making them WW, and poof, white flowers are back. The recessive trait has reappeared. So you see, the offspring are the key. If even one of them shows that recessive trait, just one white flower, you know with absolute certainty that the violet parent was carrying that hidden allele. The genetic secret is out. So what's the big takeaway from our little detective story? Well, Mendel didn't just solve one puzzle. He handed us an entire toolkit for decoding the blueprint of life. So let's review our toolkit. First, we have the law of dominance. That's the principle that tells us why some traits can be hidden. Then, we have the test cross. That's the clever tool that lets us find those hidden traits. And when you put them together, you can work backwards from what you can see, the phenotype, to figure out the invisible code underneath.
And really, it's no exaggeration to say that these basic ideas, figured out in a monastery garden over 150 years ago, are the absolute bedrock of modern genetics, from how we understand human diseases to how we engineer our crops.
But, nature always has a few curveballs. Mendel's law of dominance is perfect for a lot of traits, but is it the only way things work? What happens when one allele doesn't completely overpower another? What if they blend? Well, that's a whole other mystery and a story for another time.